And now on Rough Diamond Radio, we have part 1 of Hengist's Inheritance.
Chapter 1. Hengist Grump stirred from under his warm blanket for a second time that morning. The memory of waking the first time 2 hours earlier next to Harriet, his plump and accommodating new bride, still fresh to mind. If this was being a married man, he liked it very much. Hengist turned over onto his back and watched the dust motes floating in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through his bedroom window. The sounds of his wife busying herself in the kitchen below filtered up the stairs, blending with the cozy quiet of the morning. Eventually, swinging his legs out of bed, he sat up, scratched himself, and stretched his previously sleepy muscles. These bodily functions completed, he dressed and tramped down the stairs into the kitchen. "Morning, Mrs. Grump," Hengist said, emphasizing the Mrs. "I must say being a married woman seems to suit you." Eyeing his wife's fulsome figure, as he sat himself down at the kitchen table. "Morning to you too, my sweetheart. There's tea in the pot, toast on the way," Harriet replied, leaning across the kitchen table for the butter dish. A maneuver that gave her husband a view of her substantial cleavage. "Simply wonderful," he said, not quite under his breath. Harriet looked up at her husband and smiled. Harriet's mother had always said that the way to a man's heart was through his stomach. Harriet knew better. The toast made and the tea poured out, the newlyweds sat at the kitchen table partaking their first breakfast as a married couple in their new home, having returned from a blissful 2-week honeymoon only the day before. They munched their way through the plate of thick sliced hot buttered toast and emptied the teapot while sharing smiles and small talk. "Put the radio on, sweetheart, let's see what's been happening in the world over the last few weeks," Harriet asked. "Your word is my command, my luscious beauty," her husband replied. Hengist got up, crossed the small kitchen, and entered the lounge where he turned on the radio. Returning to the kitchen, he seated himself back at the table as the radio hissed and crackled behind him as its valves warmed up. Then a voice filled the house. "I am speaking to you from the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. This morning the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 a.m., that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I must tell you that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany." Harriet looked at Hengist, who had paused with a piece of toast halfway to his mouth. "Oh, bloody hell," was all he could say. It seemed to fit the news. It was 11:15 a.m. on the 3rd of September 1939. World War II had started. Chapter 2. Major Parker Smith slowly leaned over and switched off the radio, then turned to address the assembled officers seated in front of him. "Well, gentlemen, it appears the Hun hasn't learnt his lesson after the last lot and has come back for more." This raised a light chuckle in response from his audience. "But as you know, this was anticipated, hence why I had you all assemble here this morning." He paused to cast his eye over his assembled subordinates before continuing. "I take it my orders over the last few days have been acted upon and you are ready for deployment." Major Parker Smith received a collective "yes, sir" in reply. The major smiled, then turned to face a thin, cadaverous-looking officer wearing pebble glasses at the end of the trestle table. "Lieutenant Latchpole, what is the ammunition inventory?" The lieutenant quickly stood up. 2,000 rounds for each gun, sir," he replied, and promptly sat back down. The major turned to face another officer at the other end of the table. "And the transport inventory, Lieutenant Downs?" "All vehicles operational, fully fueled and ready to go, sir," came the swift reply. The major nodded his head to confirm this information was acceptable. Jolly good, jolly good. Captain Williams, if you would be so kind, Major Parker Smith said to a young officer seated next to him, whom promptly got to his feet, crossed the room, and removed a piece of sacking draped over an easel, revealing a blackboard on which was pinned a map. Major Parker Smith approached the blackboard, swagger stick in hand. "This gentleman is Wallop-on-Sea," said the major, tapping the map twice with his swagger stick. "As you can see, Wallop-on-Sea is a small coastal town. It has a small commercial harbor, and of course road and rail links. The town and harbor are overlooked by two headlands, one to the west," the major tapped the map at the appropriate point, "and one to the east." The map received yet another tap, both of which have substantial elevation over the town and surrounding coastline. "Our orders, gentlemen, are to proceed to Wallop-on-Sea with all haste and make operational our anti-aircraft capability to defend the town and harbor from air attack." The major paused a second to let this information sink in, then continued. "Therefore, gun number 1 and number 2, with their associated personnel, will depart at 500 hours tomorrow, under the command of Captain Rye, and deploy to grid reference." The major referred to a sheet of paper on the table. 239 216, which I believe is the flat ground atop Wallop-on-Sea's eastern headland in the vicinity of the lighthouse. He looked over at Captain Williams for confirmation. "That is correct, sir," Williams said. The major continued. "Then at 530 hours, gun number 3 and number 4, under the command of Captain Fanshawe, will relocate to grid reference 218 347, which is on the western headland in the grounds of Plumley Hall. Given the distance, both parties should be on station by mid-morning tomorrow. Observation posts will be set up in the lighthouse and on the high tower at Plumley Hall. Battery HQ and supply units will be situated in the vacant warehouses available on the dockside of the harbor. Hope that is clear, gentlemen. Are there any questions?" The major waited in silence for several seconds, then said, "No." "Good. Then you are dismissed." With a clatter of chairs, the assembled men scurried off to undertake their appointed roles. As the men filed out, the major called out, "Rye, Fanshawe, a word if you please." The two men approached their commanding officer. "Gentlemen, the unit billeting is a bit of a problem. The B-55 compulsive billeting orders have been served to the occupants of the hall and the lighthouse, which takes care of the gun crews and observation and radio teams. But the remainder will have to be catered for, I'm afraid, in and around the battery HQ at the dockside, until suitable billets can be found in the town. However, gentlemen, this gives us the problem of fraternization with the locals." Captain Fanshawe interrupted the major. "Surely, sir, there shouldn't be a problem from the locals. After all, we're all on the same side. You must expect the odd disturbance at chucking out time. Soldiers will be soldiers after all, sir." "Captain Fanshawe," said the major in the tone of voice a teacher uses when explaining something to a child for the 20th time, "I accept as inevitable, as you so eloquently put it, the odd disturbance at chucking out time. That is not the problem." "Then what, sir?" "The problem is, I will not have a repeat of the troubles our previous deployment caused at Yardley-on-Water, where we managed in 4 months to enrage the local clergy in the area to such a level that the battalion commander was subjected to an uncomfortable visit from the bishop and his legal advisor. Their complaints that our men were diluting the moral standards of the local populace and corrupting the youth of the area seemed to me not devoid of merit. That, on top of the petition from the whole council planning office demanding we be redeployed elsewhere, immediately made it very awkward for the regimental top brass." "The council planning office, sir, what in God's name did they have to complain about?" Captain Fanshawe asked incredulously. An amused grin appeared on Major Parker Smith's face. "Well, apparently, Fanshawe, during our deployment the town's birth rate was assessed likely to increase by 53% over the coming 3 months, forcing the council planners to transfer monies earmarked for the building of a council social club and bowling green. to instead fund an extension to the maternity unit, along with an increased funding for local midwife and district nurse services. But surely, sir. It was the major's turn to interrupt. But the situation I am most desperate not be repeated is the incident that involved Sergeant Dawson from Number 2 Battery. Seeing the blank expression on Fanshaw's face, the major explained. The town's mayor came home to find his wife in bed with the said Sergeant Dawson. The mayor voiced his objection to the situation and was violently thrown into the street. The doors and windows were quickly barred and locked behind him. For 3 days there was a standoff, during which time the police and vicar appealed through a megaphone to bring an end to the situation, but with no success. Luckily, it ended peacefully, I'm glad to say, when on the 4th day the mayor's wife let Sergeant Dawson go. She was never charged due to the fact she was found to be pregnant, along with her 18-year-old daughter. The major then added, stifling a laugh. I believe there was a rumor that Sergeant Dawson was recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal. All 3 officers laughed. The major continued. It got so bad at one point, the local vicar banned the young girls of the village from attending church on Sundays. He even tried to stop any of our men entering his parish at all. Why on earth did he do that? Fanshawe asked. Tell him why, the major said. Apparently, since our deployment to the area, the local vicar had been getting more and more exasperated with the behavior of some of his parishioners. Used French letters in the church porch. Crushed flowers in the garden of remembrance. You know the sort of thing. Anyway, it all came to a head one Sunday when he caught a young girl from the village and a bombardier having sex, doggy style I believe the term is, in the church bell tower while still ringing the church bell for evensong. Shocked, he staggered through the church. Seeing the verger's wife kneeling in prayer at one of the church's sedalia, he approached the lady in search of solace and support, only to find she was in point of fact performing fellatio on an officer of the regiment. Yes, well, I can see how that would upset the vicar. The officer was court-martialed, I take it, Fanshawe said. He was never traced, the major answered. Lucky man. In more ways than one. Then the grin on the major's face disappeared, and his no-nonsense demeanor returned. So gentlemen, I will not have a repeat performance, so keep the men's opportunity to partake in such activities to a minimum. The light-hearted moment passed, both men stiffened and replied. Yes, sir. Capital. See you at Wallop-on-Sea, gentlemen. You are dismissed. Major Parker Smith found himself alone in the room. He allowed himself a wry smile. Ah. Great memories. What was that verger's wife's name again? Linda. That's right. Lovely woman. She could suck a golf ball through a length of garden hose. The major pulled himself up to his full height, thrust his swagger stick under his arm, then he too marched out of the room. Chapter 3. The newlyweds sat there in stunned silence, taking in the enormity of what they had just heard. It was Harriet who spoke first. What do we do now, Hengist? She said, wiping her hands on her apron. I don't know, my love. I mean, what do you do at times like this? I can't think there is much we can do, is there? Hengist placed his half-eaten piece of toast back onto his plate. Shouldn't there be sirens or something? Harriet said, a hint of panic in her voice. She then remembered something. Where's that government booklet we got through the post? That was about what to do if war started, wasn't it? Not waiting for a reply, she quickly opening a kitchen cupboard drawer and started frantically going through its contents. Suddenly stopping her search, Harriet accusingly turned to face her husband. I thought you said there would never be another war and not to worry, she pointed out. Yes, well, it looks like I was wrong, Petal, replied Hengist sheepishly. You can say that again, my darling? Harriet continued. I'd say you were about as wrong as old Dr. Andrews' diagnosis of Betty Trumpfleet's flatulence. She looked straight at her husband. Her triplets are doing fine, I hear. She returned to her frantic search of the kitchen drawer. Hengist stretched out and took hold gently but firmly of his wife's arm. Calm yourself, my sweet, this is no time to panic. Harriet again stopped searching the cupboard drawer, and once more turned to face her husband. Seems like the perfect time to panic to me. Besides, that booklet might be important, Hengist, telling us what to do and stuff like that. Oh, where in hell is it? She said, resuming her search. Hengist sighed. He knew when he was beaten. The booklet is in the unit in the sitting room, he said. Harriet stopped searching the drawer, and leaving it open, rushed off to find the said document. She returned a minute later, waving a buff-colored booklet. Got it, she said triumphantly, starting to flick through its pages. Now let's see what's what. It says here. Hengist interrupted her. Before you start to dig up the garden to put in an air raid shelter, or taping up the windows, Hengist had read the booklet when it arrived weeks before. Why don't we get dressed properly, and take a stroll down to the town and see what's going on, he suggested. Harriet considered this suggestion, then thrust the booklet into the kitchen drawer and shut it forcefully. Good idea. Okay. Let's go, she said, removing her apron with a flourish, and throwing it over the back of a kitchen chair, she hurried upstairs to dress. Hengist buttoned up his shirt and put on his shoes. Then eyed the half-eaten piece of toast on his plate. Waste not, want not, he thought. He picked up the toast and crammed it into his mouth. He just finished, as Harriet clattered back into the kitchen. Hengist looked at his wife. She had changed her dress, put stockings on, brushed and pinned up her hair. She had even applied lipstick. All in a few minutes. Then why in God's name, he considered, does it take her so damn long to get ready when they were going to the pub? He made a mental note to bring the subject up later. Harriet snatched her coat off the hooks screwed to the back of the door and hastily put it on. Come on. Let's go, she said. Okay, Petal, just calm down, Hengist shouted after his wife as he too retrieved his coat from its hook and followed her through the door. They made their way down the garden path out the gate and briskly started towards the town. On reaching the end of the lane, they could see their elderly neighbor, Mr. Graspy, standing on his front door step, looking uneasy, shifting his weight from one leg to the other like some demented waiting bird. As they approached, he started waving excitedly. Have you heard? Have you heard? He called out to the couple. Yes, Mr. Graspy, we have. We're going into town to see if we can find out any more, Hengist called back. I told them this was coming. I went through the 1418 lot, you know. Oh, terrible it was. This last statement was directed not at Hengist and Harriet, but the scruffy-looking dog that lay at the old boy's feet. This was nothing out of the ordinary for Mr. Graspy, who could often be seen talking to animals or the odd tree. People would say such things as, poor old soul, he's losing the plot, or his mind's going these days. But such comments were grossly unfair. Mr. Graspy had never been in the possession of anything resembling a plot. His mind had also been absent without leave as far back as anyone could remember. Hengist and Harriet did not break step, but continued, assuring the old fellow as they passed that they would let him know anything they found out. As they made their way into the town, small groups of people could be seen gathered on doorsteps and street corners, all seemingly talking at once. Hengist and Harriet continued further on into the town, falling in with a small trickle of people who looked like they knew where they were going. On turning a corner, they could see another group of about 40 men and women milling about in front of the police station. A few of the men, Hengist noticed, were even wearing military uniforms from the last war. Stopping just short of the main body of the crowd, they were considering what to do next, when a hand slapped down on Hengist's shoulder and a gravelly voice said, "Hello both. Hope you had a grand honeymoon." The voice belonged to Jeff, the landlord of the Wheatsheaf, Hengist's local public house. "Yes, a lovely time, thanks, mate. We got back yesterday. Today's news takes the edge off it, though, I must say," Hengist answered. "Yes, a bit of a sod to say the least," Jeff agreed. With that, the police station door opened, and a rotund and very flustered-looking police sergeant walked out. He gingerly and with the poise and grace of a baby elephant, trying to stand on one leg for the first time, climbed onto the chair he had brought out with him to address the crowd. "Doesn't it give you a warm feeling to think 10% of our taxes go on the police force?" Jeff said to no one in particular, as they watched the overweight policeman struggle to keep his balance atop the chair. "Please, please," the sergeant called out over the numerous questions being called out and shouted at him. "Quiet please. Quiet please. Settle down," he pleaded, only continuing when he had achieved a semblance of silence from the crowd. "Right, we have received a list of regulations from the powers that be, that are to be implemented with immediate effect." The sergeant swallowed. The notices and leaflets to inform the public of the regulations to be put in place should have been distributed about the town already, but had been sitting unopened on the sergeant's desk. He hoped he would get away with his mistake in the confusion. "I have already sent several constables out to post these notices around the town," the sergeant bellowed. "Several constables, my ass. He's only got 2, and one of them standing right next to him," Jeff said under his breath. The sergeant continued. "I also have some leaflets here to inform you of the regulation that are to be enforced. Now please take a copy from Constable Kent, then go home, stay calm, and try to continue as best as possible. You will be informed of anything else, should you need to know, through the normal channels, and in the fullness of time." The sergeant half-stepped, half-fell off the chair, and disappeared back into the station, shutting the door behind him, leaving the poor Constable Kent to hand out the leaflets to the clambering mob. Hengist strode into the crowd, returning after a while with 2 leaflets, one of which he handed to Jeff. All 3 of them read the sheet of paper. "It's all 'don't do this' and 'don't do that,'" Jeff pointed out. Hengist and Harriet just looked at the paper, wide-eyed. After a further few minutes reading, Jeff sighed. "Best get back and start sorting this blackout thing, or we'll be drinking in the dark tonight." Then, with his usual "see you later," Jeff walked off in the direction of the pub, muttering under his breath. "What's this blackout thing?" Harriet inquired. Hengist consulted the sheet of paper again. "It says here, until further notice, from dusk until dawn, all external lights are to be extinguished. All internal sources of lights are also to be extinguished, or be suitably shielded in such a manner that no light shall be visible at any time externally. Failure to comply will result in prosecution." "So how in the name of all that's holy are we going to do that?" Harriet asked. "Have we got any old blankets, sheets, or curtains we could use to drape over the inside of the doors and windows?" Hengist inquired. "Nope," his wife replied. "Are you sure?" pressed Hengist. "Hengist, we only moved in properly yesterday. What you see is what we got." She paused for a second, then added, "My dad always goes and has a look in the shed for things when we needed something at home. Why don't you go look in the shed when we get back?" Hengist frowned quizzically. "But the shed's empty," he said. "I know, have I made my point yet?" Harriet said, adding by way of further reprimand, "Have we got any spare curtains?" "You prat." Okay. I'll pop out to buy some other curtain material or something, shall I?" Hengist suggested. "Well, all I can say to that is, the best of luck, duck, because my bet is, the whole bloody town is doing the same thing," Harriet forcefully explained. It crossed Hengist's mind, not for the first time, that Harriet was not above the use of bad language when she was upset. "Well, we'd best we find a way bloody quick, or we'll be living in pitch darkness from dusk to dawn from now on," Harriet concluded. Just then, a tall, well-dressed man approached them they recognized as Hengist's boss at the Wallop Gas and Coke Company. "Morning, Hengist." "Mrs. Grump." "Morning, Mr. Frome, nice to see you, bit stiff all this," Hengist said, proffering the piece of paper. Mr. Frome did not take the offered paper, just lifted his own copy, and nodded his head in agreement with Hengist. "I'm glad I bumped into you, Hengist. I was about to send young Gladstone around to you with a message, but this fortuitous meeting makes that redundant. Message Mr. Frome. Yes, I'm sorry, Hengist. I know you are on holiday, and it being your honeymoon. But due to this grave news today, I'd like to see you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. Yes, sir, was all Hengist could say. Good man, 8 a.m. sharp. Then turning to Harriet said, Never fret, Mrs. Grump. I'll not keep him too long, then he'll be free to enjoy the rest of his time off. Good day to you. Then with a slight doffing of his hat, turned and walked off. What's that about then? Harriet inquired. Buggered if I know, but I'll find out tomorrow, I guess, Hengist replied. They just stood in silence for a while, watching the milling crowd. Most seemed to be talking and waving their arms around to accentuate whatever point they were trying to make. Some were still badgering the helpless Constable Kent for answers he didn't have. Harriet, always being the most practical one of the two of them, pulled them back from their contemplations. Tell you what, to save time, you go to the baker's and pick up a white farmhouse, while I'll pop into the Pollard's hardware and see what I can find we can use for this blackout thing. We'll meet back here in 15 minutes, okay, she said. Hengist nodded his agreement to his wife's suggestion. He gave her a peck on the cheek and started to walk in the direction of the baker's. He had taken no more than 2 steps when Harriet called out. Oi! You might need this. Hengist turned back to see Harriet rummaging through her purse. Finding what she wanted, she handed Hengist a couple of coins. Hengist took the offered coins with a sheepish look on his face. Ah yes, money might be useful, he admitted. As he walked away, he considered his wife. War declared, military regulation imposed, emergency meeting called for work, the whole town in turmoil. And Harriet not only remembered they needed a loaf of bread, but noticed he had come out without his wallet. Go figure. 2 minutes later, he reached the baker's. Walking through the door, his senses were instantly bombarded by the smells of the fresh bread, pastries, cakes, and more than a hint of vanilla. Behind the counter was a rotund woman Hengist knew of old. Hi, Mrs. Peabody, how are you today? I, Hengist. Doing just grand, thanks. Both you and Harriet okay? The old lady inquired. Fine, thanks. A large white farmhouse, if you please, Mrs. P. Hengist said, placing the coins Harriet had given him on the counter. Then adding, Some rough news though today about the war, isn't it? Aye, Hengist, it's got me worried, I must say, she replied. Hengist doubted this statement. Hengist knew Mrs. Peabody was the sort of woman that on finding a live crocodile in her fridge would kill it and turn it into a handbag. Mrs. Peabody reached up and took a loaf of bread off a high shelf, placed it in a paper bag, and handed it over. There you go, young man. Hengist took the bag, then leaned conspiratorially across the counter. Got any gossip worth telling then, Mrs. P? Mrs. Peabody threw back her head with a laugh. You men are worse than us women for gossip, I swear. Not at all. Not at all. I only ask so I can keep up with my wife in regards to the local news. I bet. Mind you, Mrs. Peabody looked over her shoulder and then leaned in across the counter towards Hengist. Harriet knows that Bridget from Stackpole Street, doesn't she? Probably, Hengist replied. I'm sure she does, Mrs. Peabody continued. Well, she's been seen in Eastbourne with a stranger, and she was wearing a fur coat and long earrings. You don't say. Hengist couldn't see the problem with Bridget from Stackpole Street, whoever she was, wearing a fur coat and long earrings in Eastbourne. Or anywhere else for that matter, but felt he should say something. And I'll tell you who else is no better than she should be. There then followed a 5-minute briefing of all the town's current gossip. Mrs. Peabody was just getting into her stride when she was cut short when another customer entered the shop. Mrs. Peabody brought Hengist's gossip update to an end. Will there be anything else, Hengist? Hengist took his cue. Just the bread today, thanks, Mrs. P. He then with a wink left the shop. Within a few minutes, he was back outside the police station, bread in hand, waiting for Harriet. The crowd had all but dispersed, and it seemed that the town had resumed its normal life. It was then he saw at the far end of the high street, Mrs. Wilby Smith. She was standing statuesque in front of the memorial, erected to commemorate the glorious dead of the last war. Hengist knew there were two Wilby Smiths' names etched into the gray granite, both being the old lady's sons. Both undoubtedly died while in service of their country, and therefore assuring their inclusion on the war memorial. However, these inclusions were obtained regardless of the specifics of their deaths, those being less than glowing examples of public service. The eldest son, Captain James Wilby Smith, was the first of the brothers to qualify for inclusion on the war memorial. He was presumed drowned after falling overboard from the troopship transporting him to East Africa. It was rumored at the time of his death, but never proved, that Captain James Wilby Smith was totally smashed out of his skull on a rock, a local alcoholic brew, and had been attempting to subject a young cabin boy to an unnatural act when he slipped on a used French letter and went over the side of the ship, never to be seen again. The younger brother's death was thankfully less sordid, but undoubtedly messier. Harold Wilby Smith had been commissioned into Her Majesty's Armed Forces at the outbreak of hostilities in 1914, with the rank of first lieutenant. On being posted to a training camp in Sussex, he met a fellow officer who insisted on taking his pet spaniel dog with him everywhere he went. Harold thought this a great idea, so he purchased a 3-month-old golden retriever puppy he named Whiskey. He also started to take the dog everywhere he went. Then one day he was detailed to instruct a group of young soldiers in the use of the Mills hand grenade. The lieutenant's instructions on how to remove the pin, then after a count of 3, dispatching the weapon with an overarm lob, was faultless. But Whiskey, eager to please her new master, chased after the grenade, picked it up in her mouth, and brought it back, tail wagging, dropping it at the lieutenant's feet. The subsequent explosion ended the promising career of Whiskey and Lieutenant Harold Wilby Smith, also giving the conscripts a lesson they would find hard to forget, and an hour playing Hunt the Thimble for the lieutenant's testicles. Lieutenant Harold Wilby Smith was given a military funeral with full honors. Mrs. Wilby Smith got another heartbreaking telegram. It crossed Hengist's mind that old Mrs. Wilby Smith had no more sons to give. But how many other mothers' sons would be added to the memorial before this new war was over? It was a sobering thought. It was then Harriet appeared in front of him. "Penny for them?" she inquired. "What? Penny for your thoughts?" "Oh, just wondering what old Frome wants tomorrow," Hengist lied. "Come on, let's get back," Harriet said. Taking Hengist's arm, they headed home. It was only halfway home that Hengist remembered the blackout, and looked down to see that Harriet was indeed carrying something. "What did you get for the blackout then, my sweet?" he asked. "Wallpaper." Harriet held up 2 rolls of cheap floral wallpaper for her husband's inspection. "Wallpaper," Hengist said quizzically. "We'll cover the glass in the windows by pinning the wallpaper to the frames until I can get some curtains or such, that is." Hengist had his doubts but said nothing. Harriet continued. "We'll pin the paper to the frames when we get back, then when it gets dark you can go outside while I put the lights on to check we've not missed a bit." "Okay," replied Hengist, still doubtful. They walked home. Back at the kitchen table, pot of freshly brewed tea before them, Hengist started to recover his normal demeanor after the shock of the last few hours. "I think we should start in the bedroom with the wallpaper blackout stuff." "Why the bedroom?" Harriet smelt a rat. "Well," Hengist persevered, "we have to start somewhere, and working from the top of the house to the bottom is a good idea." Was the only reply Harriet gave. Nevertheless, the tea things cleared away. Up the stairs they both marched, wallpaper and drawing pins in hand, to start work. "Okay, you hold the paper up against the window, and I'll stick the pins in to hold it to the frame," said Hengist, taking charge. As instructed, Harriet unrolled a length of wallpaper and held it up into both corners of the window frame. Hengist, standing close behind his wife, pushed a few pins in and then said, "Hold it still, this is the tricky bit." "I am." "And hurry up, my arms are aching," protested Harriet. He shuffled even closer behind Harriet. Then in one swift movement he pushed the last drawing pin he held into the frame, and as quick as a flash, cupped both of Harriet's breasts, one in each of his hands. Harriet squealed and struggled. Hengist pretended to be unable to keep his balance, while maneuvering them both towards the bed, on which they fell giggling. 40 minutes later, they secured the second half of the paper to the bedroom window, then moved on to the bathroom. They left the downstairs windows as they had heavy curtains, albeit worn ones that might do the blackout job alone. They would see when it got dark. They sat down to an evening meal of cold ham and pickles, with thin-cut bread and butter. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 6:30, as Hengist placed the last morsel of bread into his mouth and leaned back replete in his chair. "Hadn't you better start getting ready, my sweet?" Hengist inquired of his wife. "What for?" Harriet replied, rising from the table to start clearing up. "I thought we'd go for a pint." Harriet smiled. "It will take more than an outbreak of war to keep you out of the pub, evidently." "Must keep a stiff upper lip, Petal," Hengist retorted. "Stiff upper lip? Not the only thing you manage to keep stiff, if you ask me," Harriet said, playfully prodding Hengist in the back. Hengist straightened in his chair, threw his arm out in the direction of the stairs, and in a loud voice, loaded with mock severity, began to scold his wife. "Begone from my sight, you coarse-mouthed wench. Not may you return to my presence until thou hast anointed thyself of sweet-smelling oils, and clothed thyself in silks and satins, for my pleasure and amusement. And hurry up about it, I'm gadding for a pint." Harriet laughed, placed the tea plates in the sink, and went upstairs to get ready. At 7:15, they walked down the worn track to the junction of the main road. There they turned left and on down the slight incline towards the town. The short walk to the Wheatsheaf was a pleasant one. Although the sun had not yet set fully, so the enforced blackout was not fully apparent, a full moon and crimson horizon lit their way well enough. The air had a slight nip, but only enough to be refreshing. As they approached the Wheatsheaf, two figures could be seen shuffling in the semi-gloom. With what first appeared to be a long plank, however, as they got closer, it could be seen it was a ladder. The figures were Jeff the landlord and Liz his matriarchal wife. "And what do we have here then? Is the circus in town?" Hengist called out when close enough. Jeff turned to see who had spoken. "Locked my bloody self out, haven't I?" Then with a little smirk added, "And you are just in time to help an old man out." Hengist looked at Harriet. "We could always walk on to the Crown," he suggested. "Aye, that's an idea," joked Harriet. "Stop buggering about and give us a hand, you git," said Jeff. Hengist stepped forward quickly and took hold of the ladder. "Liz," said Hengist, "you're too much of a lady to be doing this, you know." "Yes, I know it. And you know it. But someone should tell that dozy prat," Liz replied, pointing towards Jeff, who just rolled his eyes to the heavens by way of reply. Within a minute, Hengist and Jeff had placed the ladder against a window the landlord was sure was unlatched. "Okay, I'll hold the ladder while you nip up and jump through," said Jeff to Hengist. "I tell you what, I'll hold the ladder and you nip up," came Hengist's reply. Jeff just looked sideways at him. "Oh bollocks," said Hengist and started up the ladder. Reaching the window, he found it was indeed off the latch and pushed open easily. Then, with Jeff and Liz voicing encouragement, and Harriet shouting instructions to be careful, he clambered and squeezed through the opening. Halfway into the room, he heard Jeff shout up, "Bloody hell, you're making a right meal out of that." "Piss off," Hengist managed to reply as his bulk shifted and he fell into the room with a crash. There followed a series of bumps and more crashes, as Hengist navigated the dark, unfamiliar room until the light switch was found. The switch located the room flooded with light. Hengist could now indeed see what he was doing, but was also aware of everyone shouting from outside. He went back to the window and leaned out. At first he could not understand them as they were all shouting at once, then Jeff's stentorian voice boomed out. "The blackout. You fucking idiot, turn the light out." Hengist got the message and quickly flicked the switch back off. Then started the perilous journey downstairs to the front door in pitch darkness. 2 minutes later they heard the pub front door being unbolted, and it swung open. Hengist walked out. "Not sure where the switch for the lights is, Jeff. I'll leave that to you," he said. "Thanks for that, lad," came the reply as Jeff walked past into the pub quickly, followed by Liz, who winked to thank you. Hengist walked over to Harriet. "Okay, my lovely, shall we?" He held out a crooked elbow for Harriet to slide her arm through. Negotiating the thick, heavy blackout curtains that kept the light from spilling into the street, they entered the pub. Drinks purchased and coats hung up, they took a table near the window. Not that the window afforded any view, due to a pair of very heavy musky drapes had been half nailed, half hung, tightly covering them. Hengist looked around. All 5 windows in the snug had been given the same treatment. Hengist considered this gave the room a strange ambiance. A cross between that of a very poor Bedouin tent and the womb of a large rag doll. The bar slowly filled up with familiar faces. Not surprisingly, the main topic of conversation was the outbreak of war. What should have happened, what might happen, whose fault it was? Round and round went the same questions. Most people had a tale to tell, a theory to put forward. Some just sat and listened. Hengist, never short of an opinion, had said a few things to different people. But as the beer flowed and soothed his mind, he just sat back watching and listening as Harriet nattered as only a woman can. If what he picked up from the overheard snippets of conversation were true, the Germans were probably in Warsaw by now, halfway through France. Their airplanes were reducing London and Birmingham to ashes as they sat there in the pub. All dog and cats were to be put down, as there would not be enough food for pets. And without doubt, the first batch of conscription letters had been printed and posted that morning. Even the church verger was adamant that early that morning he had seen a periscope plowing through the waters off the headland. Hengist listened and concluded that if even a quarter of these stories were right, they were all deep in the shit, so he may as well have another pint. He raised himself from the table. Harriet looked up. Hengist held his empty glass up as if to prove a point, and said, "One more and we'll go home." Harriet rolled her eyes in her head. She had lost count on how many times she had heard Hengist say that. 3 pints later Jeff called time, and soon they finished their drinks, pulled on their coats, said their goodnights, and left the pub. It was then, as the door closed behind them, and the heavy drape hung inside swung back into place, the totality of the blackout became apparent. Having just left the pub's well-lit interior, they entered a pitch blackness they had never experienced. "Jesus!" Hengist exclaimed, his head spinning from the beer and lack of visual stimuli. "Hengist," Harriet called out, "where are you?" "Here I am, Petal." She could hear him very close but not see him. She stretched out her arm, contacting him. "Fuck, it's dark out here," Hengist said, still blind but now holding Harriet's hand. "Stay still for a moment, let our eyes get used to the dark," she suggested. Hengist agreed, that was a good idea. In a minute their eyes had become accustomed enough to the dark to make out each other's outline. They started the trip home. They stumbled over normally familiar ground now, however it was veiled in unspeakable blackness. Curbs that in daylight they stepped up and down without a second thought, now took on malevolence that bordered on the evil. Lampposts and road signs changed from the utilitarian helpers they appeared during the lighted hours into vindictive stationary highwaymen, who lingered in the depth of shadows to crack your head or graze your shin just for the fun of it. As you tiptoed forward to the precipice of the next curb you know to be there. One particularly trying moment occurred as they crossed the road. Gingerly they stepped off the curb and started across the road, feeling for the curb they knew to be some distance in front of them. It was then they heard the car coming up the road. They both could hear the engine getting louder and louder, but not see it. Near to panic they quickened their pace, stretching a leg out to find the far side and safety of the pavement. It was Hengist who found the missing curb first when it cracked and twisted his ankle. As he crumpled to the floor, he realized they had not crossed the road in a straight line but at an angle, which meant Harriet was quite a way out in the road. Here. Here. Over here. The pavement is over here, he shouted, as the car engine got even closer. Hengist heard Harriet scurrying. Then she also found the curb, and promptly fell over her prone husband. Both scrambled onto the pavement as the unseen car crawled past them at about a mile an hour. "What prick drives a car in the pitch black?" Harriet bellowed after the engine noise, while still laying on top of her unfortunate husband. "You're kneeling on my balls for fuck's sake," Hengist exclaimed through his gritted teeth. "Oh, sorry, darling," came the reply. They slowly got untangled and back to their feet, and continued their ordeal. 15 minutes later, Hengist and Harriet found themselves at home. However, before a cup of tea was made, Harriet insisted they check that their blackout precautions had worked. They had. Tea was brewed and drunk in near silence. Then they climbing the stairs, undressed and slipped into bed. Too knackered to repeat the sexual antics of earlier, they snuggled up and were soon fast asleep. Chapter 4. Remembering he was to report to Mr. Frome's office at 8 that morning, Hengist woke early. Attempting not to wake his wife, he gently folded back the bedclothes and as silently as he could, crept out of bed. He failed. "Morning," Harriet said, her head still half buried under the blanket. "Go back to sleep, Petal, it's early," Hengist said in a whisper. Harriet pulled the blanket back and smiled at her husband. It was the smile of a person who had slept well and for long enough. "What, and not make my husband any breakfast? Never," she said. As Hengist washed and dressed, as Harriet busied herself in the kitchen. Soon breakfast was completed, and they kissed each other goodbye on the doorstep. Hengist then started his mile walk to the gasworks. Hengist, preoccupied as he was with the meeting he was about to have at work, paid scant notice of the postman he met on his way into town, other than to give the man a polite nod of the head as he passed to acknowledge his presence. The postman for his part returned the gesture. The postman walked on a while before pausing at an old iron gate. Consulting the letters he held in his hand, he opened the gate, walked up the gravel path to the vicarage, sorting the letters as he went. On reaching the door he paused, checked one more time the address was correct, then pushed the letters through the letterbox. He then turned around and continued his round. The letters landed on the tiled floor of the vicarage's hall, with a satisfactory slap. As the vicarage's long-suffering housekeeper passed through the hall, while taking the vicar his breakfast tray. On seeing the letters drop through the door, she picked them up, placed them on the tray. Then continued to the dining room, where the vicar sat reading the paper. "Good morning, Vicar. Slept well, I trust," the housekeeper said cheerfully, placing the tray down in front of her employer. "I slept hardly a wink, I'm afraid, given the news," he tapped the war-declared headline of the paper. "But thank you for asking, Mrs. White." The housekeeper refrained from questioning the veracity of the vicar's statement. She had heard the vicar snoring loudly as she made her own way to bed. This barely an hour after the vicar himself had retired for the night. "Well, you'll feel a new man after a good breakfast, I'm sure, Vicar," Mrs. White said, while relieving the vicar of the newspaper, folding it and placing it back on the table. She'd had too many breakfasts go cold while the vicar read the morning papers. "Now eat it up before it goes cold." The vicar, doing as instructed, picked up his knife and fork and started on his breakfast. 1 sausage, 2 rashers of bacon, a fried egg, and 2 rounds of toast. Later, the vicar placed his cutlery onto his plate. Pouring himself a cup of coffee from a still steaming silver pot, he then turned his attention to his post. There were 3 letters. The first one was a seed catalog, which was put aside for later study. The second was a gas bill, which was ignored with indifference. But the third looked more promising. Its return address on the back of the envelope being a local solicitor's office. The vicar slit the envelope open with a soiled butter knife, removed the letter and started to read. The contents of the letter left him somewhat perplexed. He picked up the small handbell that sat on his breakfast tray and gave it a shake. Mrs. White dutifully appeared. "Finished already, Vicar? My, you must have been hungry," she said, making to remove the breakfast tray. "No, it's not that," said the vicar. "Oh yes, Vicar," Mrs. White said in a questioning tone. God, she hoped that sausage was all right. It had been a bit whiffy when she had put it in the frying pan. The vicar continued. "The young couple I married last week, what were their names? Wasn't Grump, was it?" "Yes, Vicar, Hengist and Harriet Grump. A lovely couple, both born and raised here in Wallop-on-Sea," Mrs. White confirmed. "Why, nothing wrong, is there?" "No, not at all, Mrs. White, not at all," the vicar said, looking back to the letter. "Do you know by any chance the names of the young man's parents?" he asked. "Well, his mother is called Mavis, I believe, Vicar." "Why, she's not in trouble, is she?" Mrs. White probed. The vicar, being wise to his housekeeper's tactics for gleaning gossip, ignored the question. "And his father?" he asked. Mrs. White looked at the vicar with a puzzled look on her face and said, "Well, nobody knows that, do they, Vicar?" "Pardon?" the vicar said incredulously. Mrs. White reiterated her point. "Nobody knows who Hengist Grump's father is, Vicar, not even his mother, I believe. Surely you've heard the story." "No, Mrs. White, I have not heard the story," the vicar said, sitting back in his chair with folded arms, then added in a slightly displeased tone, "Please enlighten me, do." Mrs. White was not sure if the vicar's displeasure was caused by the news that one of his parishioners had had the temerity to conceive a child out of wedlock, or the fact that he didn't know about it and she did. She thought it best to placate her employer. "This, of course, Vicar, was all before your time," she said, in a tone of voice that implied that such an outrageous situation would never have happened under the divine guidance of the present vicar, regardless of the evidence of the church's nursery group. The vicar smiled at this obvious attempt to butter him up, but not being totally immune to flattery, said, in a kinder tone, "Please go on, Mrs. White." The housekeeper warmed to her task. "Well, what happened, Vicar, was this. Mavis, that's the young man's mother, as I've said, apparently threw caution to the wind, so to speak, one night with a young sailor. The sailor then, presumably to return to his ship, promptly left town unaware of, how can I put it, the change in Mavis's maternal status." "Ah, I understand," interrupted the vicar, "but there must be hundreds of such happening all over the country." "I fail to see. I hadn't finished," bristled the housekeeper. "Sorry, dear lady, pray continue," apologized the vicar with a smile. Mrs. White continued. "Anyway, 9 months later the young sailor turns back up, still none the wiser to the imminent arrival of the fruit of his loins, so to speak. He then starts asking around the town where he could find Mavis, in the hope of repeating their last meeting, no doubt." The vicar commented. "Possibly so, Vicar, possibly so." Mrs. White did intensely dislike being interrupted, but she gamely continued her narrative. "Of course, by now everybody knew Mavis was expecting out of wedlock. So it soon got to the ears of Mavis's father that a sailor was asking about the town after his daughter. Well, you know how gossip travels, the Wallop-on-Sea, Vicar." "Yes, Mrs. White, I do. It's deplorable, it truly is," the vicar said, just managing to keep any hint of humor out of his voice. Mrs. White, oblivious to the vicar's implied sarcasm, continued. "And it didn't take long before the old fellow found the young sailor in the Crown, having a drink." "Finding a sailor on shore leave in a pub, who would have guessed?" the vicar interjected. The housekeeper frowned at yet another interruption, but she plowed on. "He then promptly persuaded the young lad, with the help of a shotgun no less, that a quick visit to the church would be the thing to do." "A shotgun? Dear God!" exclaimed the vicar. "I thought the expression a shotgun wedding was a turn of phrase." "Not in this case, Vicar," stated the housekeeper. "So anyway," she continued, Old Man Grump then Frog marched the lad down the high street to St. Mary's, with everyone watching on. A pony and trap were sent for Mavis. Also, your predecessor Reverend Cotter was quickly summoned from this very building to officiate over the marriage. Mrs. White paused for the vicar to comment. He didn't, so she carried on. But while waiting at the church, the young lad needed to relieve himself of the beer he'd consumed at the Crown, so he was escorted to the toilet in the vestry. But when in there he locked the door and refused to come out. Then as old Mr. Grump battered at the door, the young sailor made use of the small window in the loo by opening it and jumping out just as Mr. Grump gave the door both barrels of his shotgun. He, the young sailor that is, was last seen running towards the railway station while old Mr. Grump blasted away with his shotgun at him through the vestry toilet's window. He thankfully missed the young sailor but smashed half of the windows in the high street, killed 2 seagulls and old Mr. Dickens's cat. Dear God. That's not the end of it, Vicar. No. It was then that the pony and trap bringing Mavis to church turned onto the high street. And Mavis was greeted by the sight of her young man sprinting past her, through a cloud of feathers, as her father blasted away at him. It was simply too much for the young girl. She gave birth there and then, surrounded by broken glass, seagull feathers and bits of unlucky cat. The housekeeper straightened up proudly, her job almost done, said. And that, Vicar, is why nobody knows who Hengist Grump's father is. The vicar studied the letter he'd received. Well, I do, the vicar said under his breath. Pardon, Vicar. Oh, nothing, Mrs. White, just one more thing if you please, he added. Yes, Vicar. You don't happen to know where the young couple are living at the moment, do you? As it happens, I do, Vicar. I was talking to Mrs. Boggis in the greengrocer and she said that they're Doreen. Just the address if you please, Mrs. White, said the vicar curtly. 4 Kettle Terrace. The housekeeper said, picking up the breakfast tray and leaving the room in a huff. The vicar, rereading the letter, said to himself, Well, young Hengist Grump, have I got news for you.